to see you once again. Sort of recalling where we left off last time. We're sort of dealing with something of what I call the oldest and the greatest story ever told, Ausar, Auset, and Heru, which I think is detailing, shall we say, the birth of our civilization. Ausar is the eponymous human being, and therefore the way of life that we have to live. And that story goes back into antiquity, shall we say, even before the birth of writing as we know it, 4,000 BC. So it probably goes back even 10,000 BC, because it definitely is the oldest, and then it's repeated later on in the pyramid text and so on. It turns out to be the backbone of shall we say, psychology, and I'm going to get to that at some point in time in terms of the psychological aspect, because I think that's important. But I want to deal more with the, shall we say, the spiritual or religious aspect, because what has happened, as you know, and we'll try to illustrate as we are discussing, is that just as humanity came out of Africa, religion, if you will, and spirituality, and maybe we'll go back to that discussion of the difference between religion and spirituality, because that's also germane. But the understanding of who we are as a people, and I mean, let's go back to 200,000 years. Here we are, human beings, with all of our five senses, plus the fact, I think, an ability to perceive that is not part of our five senses. And maybe one day in our discussions we'll get to that, because I think the way we have been brought up in terms of Western understanding is all information comes to us through the five senses, but that's not an African understanding. But there we are, in a warm climate with lots of food, a few wild animals around, but having a good time. Life is good. And we wake up in the morning, we have enough food, and we relax. We talk a lot, well, at least maybe it's not with sign language, but we talk a lot. And we look at the stars and wonder about what's up there, and we see the changes in the sky and the moon and the and there it is. That's how we come to know who we are, how we come to know each other, and how to know the seasons, and how the seasons change, and where the star is this year and where it is 10 years from now, and so on and so forth. This is the beginning of everything, and we're not credited with that. Supposedly all of that was just primitive humanity. But what does primitive humanity mean when we know that as far as the brain capacity, as far as the anatomical Homo sapiens is concerned, there has been no evolution in the last 200,000 years. As a matter of fact, maybe the folks who went to Europe lost certain things. They lost the curl in their hair, they lost the color of their skin, maybe they lost their nasal apertures, they lost their lips. So, what is this primitive thing? I mean, let's talk about that for a while. How does early man become primitive?
What it is before there's civilization as we know it, before there's writing as we know it, before there's government as we know it, everything before that is what scholars call prehistory. And because human beings, as we are today, have been around possibly 200,000 years, some people say slightly more, and writing as we know it goes back 8,000 years, then everything between 200,000 years ago and 8,000 years ago is what they call prehistory. But a lot of interesting things happened over that time period. We know that 90,000 years ago, Africans in the Ishango region of Central Africa were engaged in an aquatic culture. They were making fish hooks. And those fish hooks are believed to have been used to catch catfish. And because catfish is a seasonal fish, then we've got this idea of humans engaged in planning and strategy to plan to catch this fish, which is seasonal. And the fish hooks themselves, fish hooks of similar designs, ended up in West Africa, ended up in the Nile, and ended up in the Middle East. And so this might show spread of culture from Central Africa to West Africa, and from Central Africa to the Nile and into the Middle East. Mm-hmm. Then we have 43,000 years ago, evidence that Africans were digging the world's first mines. And they were doing that in Swaziland, some people call it Eswatini. And these mines are the oldest mines in the world. So one of the reasons that Europeans used to justify apartheid is if it wasn't for Europeans subjugating Africans, putting them under apartheid, the mineral wealth of Southern Africa could never have been pulled out of the ground. And no worse lie has ever been told. Southern Africans invented mining 43,000 years ago. Then the notions of time that we have today, the beginnings of the month. There's an artifact called the Lebombo bone, and the Lebombo bone found in Southern Africa is a baboon fibula, which is about this long, which has got different notches carved into it. And there's 29 notches, there's 30 spaces. And so this gives us this notion of 29 and a half, which is the same length as a lunar cycle, which is the same length as a menstrual cycle, showing that the very first people to spot the connection between the lunar cycle and the menstrual cycle would have been African women. And they did this, some people say 37,000 years ago, some people say 42,000 years ago. So that's the beginning then of humans creating time by mapping the moon. And there's a scholar, an Englishman, Gerald Massey, writing in 1907. His book was called Ancient Egypt, the Light of the World. And he theorized that because the ancient Egyptians had animal deities and animal-headed deities, this represents that the ancient Egyptians had preserved some of the religious ideas coming out of inner Africa in very, very early times. And some scholars, such as African-American professor Charles Finch, believes that he can trace the first few stages of how religion evolved from the worship of tracking the moon, tracking the sun, tracking the stars. Mm-hmm. And then out of this, we get the idea of 12 houses in the sky. And the 12 houses in the sky become 12 months. They become 12 signs of the zodiac. And then lots of religions have deified this principle of the number 12. So 12 becomes a sacred number. So you've got, in some religions, the 12 labors of Heracles. Other religions, you've got the 12 tablets of Gilgamesh. So this notion of 12, representing the 12 houses in the sky, the 12 signs of the zodiac. And there's been a whole bunch of research where people have, so one route that scholars have used has been to look at the different animal and animal-headed deities and trace it that way. Mm-hmm. Another route that people have used is to use astronomy and trace it that way. And then the astronomical theory says that astronomy was born in ancient Kush or Nubia or Sudan. Mm-hmm. And then it went to the Egyptian city of Waset or Thebes. And, you know, there's in one of the Egyptian temples, the Temple of Dendera, there's 12 signs of the zodiac on the ceiling. And then some people have then researched it in that way. So whichever way you want to look at it, astronomy, mm-hmm. or looking at the animals and animal-headed deities, mm-hmm. we come to the same conclusion, the African origin of religion.
Yeah, and you mentioned two very important people. Certainly Gerald Massey broke new ground, and he was a great scholar in terms of linking Egypt to the rest of Africa. And you know, Charles Finch has done an excellent job in terms of shall we say, showing the relationship both between the Old Testament in terms of Judaism and the New Testament, if you will, in terms of Christianity, and the rootedness in Africa. You know, and of course, you know, you can show the table of nations, you know, coming out of Ham. You know, it's all in the Old Testament, and Nimrod in Babylon, you know, and it shows you, you know, the relationship with the Canaanites, and Mizraim is Egypt. So that whole area, and Saba, which is where you have the Arabs, so to speak, you know, and SBA, you're talking about astrological, SBA is star in the hieroglyphic language. So they were the great astronomers there also, in terms of that. And we know Sheba comes out of that kingdom there that was, you know, parallel, shall we say, across the Red Sea. So that whole area. Babylon, which, you know, ended up the Shinyar, they were obviously black people, and then you go into to India, you know, Mohenjo-daro and Harappa. So that whole Near East and going further east was all African before the Indo-European invasion.
Greetings, I'm Robin Walker of The Black Secret. Keen to popularize Pan-African heritage, we have two products that should interest you. We are giving away an introductory free book called 100 Black History Facts. Click here to claim your free book. Secondly, our online course, The Black Secret, has 55 hours of filmed content. You will systematically learn every major theme in our history, going all the way back. Click here for more information.
You know, probably took place, I don't know, somewhere, 5,000 plus 6,000 BC, something like that. But it's important to understand too the origin of so-called Semitics. Again, that's a term that's really a mixture of the Indo-European invasion and the autochthonous, if you will, African or Africoid populations of Africa itself, the Near East, and of course what we would call Arabia.
Can I jump in there, sir?
I'm sorry?
Can I jump in there, sir?
Yeah, please, yeah.
Yeah, there's a theory which is actually now mainstream that says that Semitic comes from Africa, not the Middle East.
Mm-hmm.
What's happened is, as people have looked at languages in countries like Ethiopia, Eritrea, Sudan, that kind of region, there's a theory that is now developing that what's called Afro-Asiatic is a group of languages, and their origin is somewhere in and around Ethiopia. So some people think it's to the north, more Eritrea region. Some people think it's more to the south, Ethiopia, Kenya region. Some people think it's more the Sudan region. And the languages that come out of that is Hausa, which is in northern Nigeria, ancient Egyptian, Cushitic is more or less Somali, Berber, which is the language of the black folks in the desert, the Tamashek speakers in the desert. And all of these languages are ancestrally from one place, and that one place is somewhere in and around Ethiopia. So this is what that means. The theory that Sheikh Anta Diop had, which is that Semitic people were a mixture of Africans and Europeans, that now might be an old and outdated theory, because the new position seems to be that Semitic originated somewhere in East Africa, and the place in East Africa is somewhere around Ethiopia, Eritrea, Kenya, and Sudan. So Semitic is from one of those places. And consequently, the very first Semitic speakers would have been sub-Saharan Africans. And the only thing is what we don't know is, did they look like Ethiopians? Did they look like Eritreans? Did they look like South Sudanese? And that's the discussion. It's one of they would look like one of those three populations. So this is changing the game, because what it means is we now no longer have to concede Semitic. And so the people that today call themselves Semites, they've got some explaining to do.
It comes out of an African language, and I think that gentleman was Greenberg. I'm not sure of his first name, but
correct.
The linguist, that was his theory originally, and it's being accepted by more and more people. And it's called Afro-Asiatic, but it's really African, and then that offshoots into Asia, etc., etc.
And it's a shame that he called it Afro-Asiatic, because that's propaganda. That's propaganda. It should be East African origin family, full stop.
Yeah. But it's a concession to the previous theory. So that it can be accepted by scholars. So interesting. Again, it shows the common. I'm getting over a cold, so you have to excuse me.
No, take your time, sir.
I may have these coughing fits periodically, but I did want us to continue with our discussions. One of the interesting movements, again, is into the India, because I find it interesting, because I'm a bit of a student of Buddhism, etc., and Eastern traditions for quite a while, without necessarily knowing the connection. But again, if you go through Mohenjo-daro and Harappa and the indigenous civilization, and you learn a little about the origins of Indian history, and the conflict that existed then between the Indo-Europeans and the Dravidians, which were the original inhabitants, and of course the eventual conquest, and then almost liquidation, or destruction, shall we say, of the original civilizations. A lot of the Dravidians ended up going into the forest, and these were the sadhus in terms of the religion. And the religion that has come out of India, and people talk a lot about the Vedas. The Vedas are something that the Indo-Europeans brought in, but what really did, how should I say, what has come to the fore in terms of really what we think of Indian religion and what has taken over as Indian religion, and what has come out of the Upanishads, which comes from the original Dravidians, and which ends up as Sankhya philosophy and ends up as Vedanta, which is again what we know as the sort of Indian religion of enlightenment. And this is the religion in which Buddha arose. And if we look at the original statues of Buddha, and of course they still have them, with the curly hair. Sometimes the features now have been transformed to, quotes, Asiatic features, if you will. But that iconography still maintains itself. So we know that Buddha was a black man. Again, if you look at the early statues, and he came out of that same spirituality, religions, shall we say, that came out of Africa. And I know you know that period very well in terms of the conflict, and then the whole caste system that came out of that. And with the dominance then of Sanskrit and the European ideas with the Vedas as religion and so on, and pushing everything out, down and out into the forest, as well as into southern India. And of course, the darkest people, Indians, are in southern India and so on, as well as at the bottom of the scale in terms of the caste system in India. So we see how that has come out of Europe, and has gone to the east, has come out of Europe, and has gone to the west, if you will, all over the rest of the world. That same idea of supremacy, which is so inimical, to the advancement of people and civilization itself, because it's a claustrophobic mindset.
Yeah, let me say a little bit about that.
Yeah.
My research shows that the oldest religion in the Indian region was the worship of Lord Shiva. And the religion was called Shaivism, or if you're going to give it a modern name, you would call it Shaivism. And this is where the religion is represented as a serpent called Kundalini. And then you've got the different chakras. And each one starting at the bottom of your spine and then ending up in your pineal glands. Some people say the top of your head. Each one represents a higher and higher stage of enlightenment. And you also have, with India, the deities had male and female pairs. So you had Shiva, you had Shakti, which is the female. You also had Vishnu, male, you had Sattva, who's female, and there are many, many, many others. But this is, as you rightly say, sir, pre-Hinduism. This is not Hinduism. And as you rightly say, this is coming out of the Upanishads. And these ideas of you becoming enlightened, symbolized by, if you like, traveling up your spine to either get into the Guru Chakra. This idea, there's a whole series of religious practices that go with these religious practices. And the religious practices could be pranayama, breath control, diet, cleansing practices, meditation, correct living, and so on. And that is the oldest religion. And there seems to be evidence that we can trace that religion to the Indus Valley. And the Indus Valley civilization was definitely a Black civilization. We know that the Indus Valley civilization, sickle cell was a major problem in that civilization, because the surviving skulls show evidence of the kinds of, if you like, damage or alteration consistent with a sickle cell population. And we also can trace, in terms of languages, what was probably spoken in the Indus Valley would be related to what the Dravidians, Tamils, whatever term you want to use, are speaking. So the connection is definitely there. Now, as you rightly say, there was an Aryan conquest. My research says that took place between 2000 BC and 1500 BC. Now, a lot of Hindu scholars have tried to deny this Aryan conquest because they look at it as this is European propaganda to take their history. But as far as I know, if there was no Aryan conquest, the language spoken by the Hindu speakers would be unrelated to European. But it's not unrelated, it's related. Do you see? It's related. So as you say, the Hindu religion took a lot of the original deities and turned them around and turned them into part of a system that unfortunately one could call an early form of apartheid, based around color and shade-ism taken to the nth degree. And that system, with the appropriate modifications, is the system that's in place now. So what then happened was, because Hinduism was oppressing the dark-skinned majority, you then had large numbers of Black people saying, no, forget this. And so there's a theory that the elevation of Lord Krishna in Hinduism was to win the Black populations back to Hinduism. It was a propaganda move.
It means black in I don't know if it's in Sanskrit or whatever Indian language, right?
Yeah, correct, yeah. And I've seen images. I use an image, there's a 14th century image from one of the temples, which I use as teaching material, where Krishna is indeed jet black. And the Hindus have made Krishna an earthly manifestation of Vishnu. And that was a way of winning people back. But then the indigenous people had their own ideas, and they came with an anti-caste religion. And that's where the Buddha comes in. So he was preaching against the caste system.
As adults and parents, how much do we really know about Black history beyond Malcolm X, Mary Seacole, the slave trade, and the man who invented the traffic lights? Greetings, I'm Robin Walker of The Black Secret, keen to get everybody up to speed with their history and heritage. I'm giving away a powerful free book called 100 Black History Facts. Click here to claim your free book.
Preaching against the caste system. And then there was a time period in Indian history when the Dravidians were back in power, and they promoted Buddhism heavily. And so Buddhism became a big thing. But then as the Aryans gathered more and more strength, they were able to push Buddhism mostly out of India. So it ended up in Sri Lanka, it ended up in the Far East, because essentially, if people wanted to maintain a caste system, and here you have a new religion teaching against the caste system, they decided to stamp on it. And so it ended up in Sri Lanka. And again, I use teaching material. There's a very famous Sri Lankan city called Anuradhapura. And there's this massive image of the Buddha known as the sleeping Buddha or the reclining Buddha. And the hair is fully intact, and that needs to be seen. So if you're watching this, Google the sleeping or reclining Buddha from Anuradhapura in Sri Lanka. And yeah, we get some idea of exactly what type of hair the Buddha had.
And I think it's interesting, as you mentioned now, that Buddhism went from India throughout the rest of Asia, and you can trace it into Tibet, you can trace it into China, you can trace it into Korea, you can trace it into Japan, and you know, Padmasambhava and different Indians, Atisha and so on, spread it throughout, and it actually joined with or replaced to some degree the original, you know, Chinese religion, if you will, of Taoism. Although, you know, the blend is really very, very similar. So I don't think there's any, you know, significant difference between the two, so to speak. The East very heavily has been influenced by this African spirituality coming out from Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, the Dravidians, the Buddhists, etc., etc., etc. And I think it has been the basis of their civilizations. And in Japan, it's mixed with Shintoism, which tends to be an older religion, but I don't think it's antagonistic, because Shintoism, I think, tends to be a sort of shamanism, kind of an earth religion. So there's not really a distinction, but I think Buddhism is much more sophisticated than Shintoism. And we know that Buddhism has been responsible for so much of the art and the intellectualism of Japan, you know, as it has been also in China and in Tibet.
And also the martial arts as well, sir.
There you go. Yeah. I was forgetting. I was forgetting that. I mean, it's been the basis of Asian culture for a long time. The discipline, the creativity, and as you mentioned, in terms of the martial arts, as part of the physical discipline, as you know, it's basically a mental discipline primarily. So that's the physical discipline aspect of it. Let's come back to how now the spirituality coming out of Africa manifested itself in Babylon, you know, back in the day, with the Hebrews, and let's revisit maybe how the Hebrews got started. Were they the Hyksos? who were maybe shepherds or from Eastern Egypt or the Near East, who were living in northern Egypt, or northern Kemet, shall we say, and over time sort of took over part of the government because they never really took over Egypt, and there was never really any battle. But
Let
some,
me address that. Let me address that.
go ahead, please.
Here's the problem, sir.
Mhm.
This is the most controversial topic. And the problem is all of the facts are disputed.
Yes.
And because all the facts are disputed, we don't really have any facts that we can say, okay, we can start with this fact, we can run with this.
All right. Let me ask you about Appian and Manetho.
Mm-hmm.
I know we don't have much of them, but what we have Josephus talking against them.
Okay. All right, let's go there. Let's go there. All right. According to Manetho, Egypt was overthrown in the 15th and the 16th dynasties by a group of people called the Hyksos. And these are people coming out of the East, but we don't really know what that means. It could be the Middle East, but we know that when they were kicked out, they went on to build Hiroslima, and Hiroslima is Jerusalem. So there's your link that says they could have been Jews. All right, now, I believe.
Are we going to make a distinction between Jews and Hebrews?
Okay, let's
significant.
Okay, let's use Hebrews. Yeah, no. Well said, sir. So here's the thing. I've done a lot of research in trying to reconstruct ancient Egypt's timeline, and the standard theory that ancient Egypt began 3100 BC, and therefore you can cram all 30 odd dynasties. Your starting point is 3100 BC, and your period when the Greeks took over was 332 BC. My research says that's impossible. You can't fit that amount of history into that amount of time. And the idea that there were simultaneous dynasties running through dynasties 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, and simultaneous dynasties 7, 8, 9, 10, and 11, and therefore you can then compress the timeline. My findings are you can't do that. And consequently, Egyptologists have been faking the history of Egypt. They've been faking the timeline. Now, if we stretch the timeline out properly, then it does mean that the Hyksos did indeed rule Egypt unopposed. They were, if they wanted to call themselves the lords of the two lands, my research says that would stand up in court. Yeah. Okay, so the time period, in my research says that the Hyksos were on the thrones between about 2500 BC and 1709 BC. And so that was the time period.
500 and 700?
1709.
So that's 800 years?
Basically 700 years. They were on the throne for 700
because my thinking about it goes back, it was less than 100 years in my memory. But
yeah.
let me
explain that. Let me explain that. The idea that it was less than 100 years is Egyptologists faking the funk by squashing dynasties 13, 14, 15, 16, and 17 into a time period that's impossible. In other words, not unlikely, impossible. But because they know that you don't know that, they can do that. Do you see? Yeah. Okay, now, so the question now is where did the Hyksos come from? Now, we know from the record that they ended up in Jerusalem and they ended up building Jerusalem. But does that mean that that's where they came from? Does that mean that when it says people from the East, does it mean the Middle East? All of this stuff I can't prove. All of this, yeah. Then we have the other complicating factor that one of the pharaohs, Merneptah, had a monument where he describes beating up what he calls the 9 bows. and the 9 bows are 9 powers in the Middle East, and one of them is Israel, and it actually says Israel. And if Merneptah was,
does he say Habiru, right?
yeah,
Habiru.
yeah, and then it's then translated as Israel's seed is destroyed. No, Israel is destroyed, his seed is not. Yeah. So the question now then is, if that's true, then how could the Israelites have been in Egypt during the time of his father, Ramesses II? And which bits of this is true and which bits of this is false? And the truth is, I can't work it out. Do you see? I can't work it out. Then we have the fact that outside of the Merneptah stela, I don't think there's any evidence that Israel even existed, or Hebrew. You know what I'm saying? Do you see? So the whole thing is controversial. Now, this is what the Jews themselves say. They say that among them arose a prophet, Moses, and Moses is the person that wrote the first 5 books of the Bible, is the person that laid out Jewish or halacha law. And
Moses was learned in all things Egyptian.
Right, right. So does that make him an Egyptian priest? Probably yes. But then the next question is, if he was an Egyptian priest, was he really a Hebrew, or did they make that up? Again, I'm just raising questions. So when it comes to the Israelites, the first solid facts that I think we can stand on is during the time of the Assyrian ruler, Sennacherib, there are images of them. And those images definitely show Black people.
Okay, what period of time is this?
660-ish BC.
That's
Sennacherib was one of the Assyrian rulers, and he had sculptures put on his walls of all the people he's beating up. So he beats up the Jews from Lachish. He beats up the Egyptians in Thebes. He beats up the Cushites in Thebes, and he beats up the Elamites. And so we've got images of the Elamites for that reason. We've got images, foreign images of Egyptians and Cushites. And guess what? They're almost the same.
Yeah.
Do you know what the difference is between the Egyptians and Cushites? Have a guess.
Their dress?
Yeah. The Cushites have got feathers in their hair. That's the difference. Yeah. And you can see the Cushites with the feathers in their hair, the Egyptians with no feathers in their hair. They're identical otherwise. But significantly, there's images of the people of Lachish, and the people of Lachish are thought to be Jews, and they are definitely woolly-haired Blacks. So does that mean then that Judaism is a Black religion, or does it mean that during that period they were Black? Again, I don't know.
Well, you know, Finch has a lot to say about that. But I want you to go on to the Exodus, because that's also of great significance, because the period of time, especially since you have expanded the chronology of Egypt, the period of time when they were in Egypt, was now what you're saying is 700 years or 500 years, 700 years. So they must have adapted and acclimatized themselves to Egypt in terms of its religion, in terms of its culture, because they didn't come in as a majority people, they came in as a minority people. So they must have absorbed this particular culture. And I'm sorry?
The archaeology
Yes.
claims that one of their capitals was called Avaris.
Yes.
And in that capital, they were worshiping Baal. So the claim is they were worshiping Baal. And Baal is close to the deity Set. So, and there's a theory that there was some friendship between the Cushites and the Hyksos, And the commonality was their deity Baal was close enough to the Kushite deity Set. And then they were able to flex on that similarity in religion. But here's the thing: the worship of Baal is not Judaism as we have it now. Yeah. Okay, the next snapshot that we have, which I think is again relevant, and again, this is something that probably would stand up in court. There was an archaeologist called A.H. Sayce, and he was writing in about 1911. Someone could correct me if it wasn't 1911. They discovered a Jewish temple at Elephantine. And that Jewish temple at Elephantine was built just like the Egyptian temples, except it was definitely dedicated to Yahu, and Yahu is thought to be Yahweh. And the significance of
Elephantine is pretty close to Thebes or Luxor, isn't it? It's deep in the south of Egypt.
That's just it. It's further south. It's further south than Thebes. It's further south. Elephantine.
I'm trying to make the point that it's not the Delta region where the Hyksos were.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. It's the Egypto-Nubian border. And that's why, if you read in the writings of people like Tacitus and Celsus, they're debating about should the Jews be classified as Egyptians or Ethiopians. And what they mean by that is, are they Kemites or Cushites? And that's because Elephantine.
Let me stick a pin there and pick your brain.
Yeah.
Because this is interesting. This is the first I've heard of that. Because Elephantine, I think, is a root that David and Sheba's a son, I think, took that route to take the golden calf in Ethiopia.
Yeah.
And there's some connection, I can't remember it historically, between, and again, let's bring in Akhenaten into this, because Akhenaten sort of overthrew the religion of Egypt in terms of its basis on Amun-Ra and Ptah, and he sort of worshipped Ra as a symbolic object, as an object as opposed to a symbol of something that was metaphysical. And he grew up and was educated in the Delta region, therefore possibly having some of that Hyksos influence. And he was like somebody coming on the throne that was not truly part of the usual thing, shall we say, in terms of Amun-Ra and that kind of situation. So, and he overthrew the religion. And you know, when he was overthrown, and we get into Tutankhamen and so on, and you need to elaborate on that for us. All mention of him was wiped out, you know. And there's a possible similarity between him and Moses. There's a possible similarity with an Exodus that, you know, that the Atenites, if you will, some would have gone north and maybe into Canaan or what have you. Some may have gone into Ethiopia. And that's where folks, or some of the original religious Ethiopians, shall we say, when he took over, they may have gone into Ethiopia. So, you know, then we fast forward to all of these Jewish people being in Ethiopia and being going to Israel. Can you imagine that period? Or tell us something about those historical connections?
Yeah, here's the thing. As ever, all of what you've just said is controversial, all of it. But the theories that you've heard, the theories that you've presented are theories that people run with, yeah? So in other words, it's grounded, but the problem is again, the controversy is big. Okay, let's talk about them. Pharaoh Akhenaten certainly was a stronger believer in this idea of one single image of the deity. The scholars say that the name of the deity was Aten, A-T-E-N, and so that's his name, Aken, Aten. When Tutankhamen ended up on the throne, he was originally Tutankhaten, A-T-E-N, And the capital city was the city of Akhetaten, not Thebes. And that's the first garden city in the world, the first planned city planned in that particular way with gardens and all that kind of stuff. Okay, now, so the standard theory then is Akhenaten changed the religion to a much stricter one symbol image. And the way that you've described it might be exactly how it happened, you know, influence from the Delta, that kind of thing. Yeah, but that would imply that the Delta had one deity, and we don't really know what they had. We know they had Baal, but we don't know what. Do you see? Yeah, could have happened that way. Okay, now what's the link between this one deity and Elephantine in Ethiopia? Certainly, I'm of the opinion that Ethiopia's Jews were originally from Elephantine, the Egypto-Nubian border. And I think that they migrated from there to modern Ethiopia, where modern Ethiopia is on a map. Not sure when that happened. Did it happen during the time of Solomon and Sheba? Is King Solomon even a real person? Don't know. That's another discussion. Now, in the case of Akhenaten, there is a link between Akhenaten and the Bible. There is a hymn written during the time of Akhenaten called the Hymn to Aten. And then many people have looked at the Hymn to Aten and they've realized, God damn, Psalms 106 is word for word. Yeah. Again, I'm speaking from memory. So when I speak from memory, turns out it wasn't 106, it was another one. But there's one of the Psalms that is definitely word for word. And you can even Google this. Again, people watching this, Google this, Hymn to Aten, and one of the Psalms, and you'll actually see that it's word for word, line for line. Yeah. So certainly some of Akhenaten's teachings did indeed end up in the Tanakh. And there's an obvious example. All right, so the next question now then is there a link?
Next question is, was he Moses?
Was he Moses? Don't know. And was that the Exodus? Because you see, this is what I think the Exodus really was. Okay. I think the Exodus was the kicking out of the Hyksos by the 18th dynasty. So that would have been the end of the 17th dynasty, pharaohs like Seqen-Enrtal and Kamose, and then 18th dynasty pharaohs like Amenhotep I and Pharaoh Ahmose. And they are responsible for booting the Hyksos out, and they ended up in Hiroshima or Jerusalem. I think that was the Exodus, but no one wants to say that for obvious reasons.
Interesting. The history of that period is so vexed because again, people don't want to give the credit where the credit is due, and as you mentioned, they try to truncate history and make it seem that whatever came before, you know, Greece or Rome or the Judeo-Christian period was strictly barbarism, you know, and was irrelevant to the further growth of anybody. And it's amazing when you read, you know, so many of the scholarly works, and they go back, you know, to talk about metaphysics, and they never go any further than quotes the light of Asia. You know, there's no light that comes out of Africa. Africa is the darkest continent, and yet still all of the light, you know, really, you know, comes out of Africa. We talked about Alset and Heru, and clearly that story, you know, has great significance in terms of Christianity.
Can I jump in there, sir?
Yeah, please. Yeah. You know that cough. Please go ahead.
According to Professor Maulana Karenga, there's a series of texts called the Declarations of Virtues.
Mhm.
And let me read one of them. I gave bread to the hungry.
That's not Ma'at. That's not about Ma'at, is it?
It is, his book is about Ma'at, yeah.
Okay, great. Go ahead.
And it says, I gave bread to the hungry and clothes to
Yeah.
the naked, and gave a passage in my own boat to those who could not cross. I was a father to the orphan, a husband to the widow, a protection from the wind to the shivering.
Mhm.
I am the one who spake what was good and related what was good, not a scandal monger. I acquired my possessions in a just manner.
Mhm.
Doesn't that sound like stuff coming out of Christianity? Doesn't that sound just like stuff in the
Absolutely.
New Testament?
Absolutely.
So as you rightly say, people want to give the impression that
Mm.
African thought was of no value. And you can pull up passages and just compare them. Compare this to what's in the New Testament.
Mhm. Mhm. And again, you know, the story of Ausar and Auset. You know, Ausar was slain by his brother Seth, and of course,
Yeah.
Seth represents Satan. And then his quote sister wife, and again, you know, we have to be careful how we use these terms, because I think they're just principles. It's a male and female principle. It really has nothing to do with what we call sister or wife, or in that sense, because it's not incestuous at all. So his female, you know, counterpart, you know, Isis or Outset, you know, goes around collecting his parts, and the only part she couldn't find was the penis, and she puts those parts together and has a relationship with those parts, and of course she was a virgin, and of course here's an immaculate conception because there's no penis; it's an asexual relationship. And she becomes impregnated again by the Holy Spirit, if you will, from Ausar, and gives birth to Heru or Horus, you know, later on. And then she grows up, Horus or Heru, and he fights Seth, defeats Seth, and then resurrects his father. He goes down to the inner world and resurrects his father. So here's the resurrection. The resurrection story, because his father had been mummified and so on and so forth. And he goes down to the underworld or the inner world, shall we say, resurrects his father. And of course, who is there? They're the two ladies, you know, Martha and Mary. They're the two ladies, you know, Auset and Nephthys. So it's a total, you know, similar story. And he's the Karas, he's the anointed one who is able to do this. And that's what Christ means, the anointed one. And you go further, and this is in Finch's thing, and you know the story, you may know it better than I do, in Ammon's temple in Luxor, more than 1,500 years before the birth of Jesus. You have this whole scenario, which is both the nativity, which we have the gospel nativity, and the first scene where Tehuti is the messenger, you know, coming from God and telling the lady Metemua that she's going to have a baby. And then there's Neph, which is the spirit, the breath, you know, impregnating her, if you will. So you have that whole thing, the Annunciation, and you have her conceiving, and then the third one is Horus sitting in her lap, you know, which is then the birth, and then you have the adoration of the child with the three wise men, if you will, coming from different parts to adore the child. So here you have all of this on the walls of temple in Luxor, and this is supposed to be, you know, now historically correct, you know, 2,000 years ago. I mean, come on, this was 1,700 years before the birth of Christ. And here it is on the walls of, and it's an allegory to talk about the divine king, because the Egyptian kings were divine kings. And of course, it also means all of us are divine kings. So, which is the essence of Christianity. And this is where the whole thing has been distorted. You know, as it was distorted in terms of its going to the Far East when it became contaminated with the Vedic system, and we see it becoming contaminated with the Judeo-Christian interpretation of the African spirituality, which is above each and every one of us who has this journey to make, to become also, to resurrect our true self. That is the true journey of man, and that's what Heru means. Heru means hero. It means the one who has made that journey and really resurrected himself so that he's a full human being and then obedient to the principles of Maat, which you just talked about. And Coringa has done a great job in terms of bringing that forward, the whole Mattian concept, because that's the basis of the ethics, etc., and values of the Egyptian system.
Yeah, in total agreement, sir. And what it is so many more of not just our scholars and thinkers, but even our theologians, be you Christian, Muslim, Jewish, Rasta, we should be mining this data to pull out ethical value that modern people can use today, because otherwise it just goes to the waste.
Yeah.
And the scholars will be able to pull out use, but the ordinary people can't. And there is too much there that we cannot really ignore.
I think I want us to do next time is to trace this African spirituality, if you will, across the continent in terms of its manifestation, let's say in Congo, in the Bantu, in the Yoruba, in the Ashanti, in the Dogon. Because I believe it's the same spirituality with certainly certain cultural, historical differences, which you can trace the principles as life guiding principles, like the Ubuntu concept and so on. I mean, that goes straight back to Ma'at, and as you say, it needs to be mined, it needs to be explicated as much as we can, because that's what we really have to hold on to, because I think that's what we have to offer as African people, the ability to know ourselves and know each other and to be able to live in communion with each other and with the environment, because what's happening is now the full destructive force of Western materialism and intellectualism was aimed at the planet, and that includes us, both animals, plants, and the physical planet itself in a destructive sense, simply to satisfy, a hedonistic way of life. So hopefully we will get to this next time.
Absolutely, sir.
Thanks so much.
No, it's a pleasure, sir.
Well, you bring so much to the table, Robin. It's always a pleasure.